Hello and welcome back to my channel, Chess Captures Threats. In today's episode 39 of the Chess Guide, we'll be going over strong versus weak pawns. So this is the second one of the strong versus weak collection here. So we've just gone over the king, now we're going to go over the pawns. So here we have 4 examples. We're going to have 2 where they're strong, where the pawns are, so whether it's going to be attacking and defending, and also we're going to have 2 which are weak. So these first 2 we're going to go strong versus weak in scenarios where more or less endgames here. So what happens if it's good pawn structure, bad pawn structure, what happens. And then in our second part here we're going to also go over defending, so how pawns can be good, are they best like this or like in this scenario. So here we go. So in this first example here we are going over good pawn structures. So being white go here, the evaluation here says that we're winning. Now if we have a look at the pawn structures, black and white are doing very well here. We have both got, the same amount of pawns. Firstly, we've been able to keep as many pawns as we can on the board, but every single pawn, is good, I think, other than this pawn here for black, which does prove to be quite bad in the end. So just to make sure here, so we can clarify, we have a nice little pawn chain here, just 2 pawns, and it's heavily guarded by blacks also there. This is what we call an isolated pawn, and then we have these 3 pawns here, which, remembering that this pawn here is a backward pawn because it cannot be pushed without being captured by an enemy pawn. So it's black structure, and then here we also have some very good pawn structure here for white compared to maybe this little arrow-like shape. Also, from the last episode with the strong versus weak king, now obviously here both have got their king in the right position, so they're not, back here with the white king or something. So why this is good structure is because if we look at black's pawn here, as white plays this move with the king, this is now forced to move many different places here. So if it goes to this square, we're now going to be able to cut in because of this black pawn, and it's now limiting this black king to very little things. So when the king can't move, otherwise it loses the pawn, it's kind of getting stuck behind everything. So you see, really, if it goes here, it's the same thing. This time it's actually, you think it can get through, but it's now going to win this pawn here, and slowly we're going to be able to promote both of these. So that pawn there kind of being the pivot with where the king's opposition, remembering that opposition is like this, but obviously with the pawn in front it's a little bit difficult because obviously white hasn't got these 2 squares, for example, or even these 2. But hopefully you understand there that even with these pawn structures, your king will aim for the backward ones, and with such good pawn structures, if we use what white is protecting, if we go back to the beginning squares here, it is protecting all of these squares that these pawns are doing. So if we see here, that is every square that just the white pawns are protecting. So almost, and then if you include the king here, it actually limits that black's king cannot get through anywhere. If you look at any passage of play here, it will not be able to get through. So that is what we call good pawn structure, and it's strong versus this. Now this just looks offensive already, seeing how we've got 2 double pawns here. We've got nearly an isolated pawn. We've definitely got an isolated pawn here, and we've got some sort of protection here, but it's not very good. Now don't get me wrong, black's isn't half as good, but it's still good, much better. It's got an isolated pawn, but it's blocking both of these, which makes these double pawns not very good, especially on the side of the board. Same with these 2. But this time, in the middle, they've got a very good connection. Maybe this is an arrow shape still, but, being in the centre of the board, that stops all of these squares. So all it takes is for black's king to just get into play here, and very quickly you'll see how what we can do here is, again, like what we did with white, we can actually make this king move out the way, and now we've got 2 pawns in the centre against the king, and none of the pawns can move. So again, what's happened here is, you know, the useless pawns here almost are not being able to do anything for this white king. It's almost acting, as it's just there on the board and you just can't go to those certain squares. So hopefully there we understand what strong and weak pawn structures are. Now in this position, we're going to go over the defensive ways. So as we've gone through many times, you'll hear this. I'll keep saying it in most videos, that how pawn structure should be. You should always know, always keep saying it, because you just got to keep reminding yourself. There is many times where maybe for example you're doing an opening and you'll always forget one certain move. So as long as you keep doing that, and I keep trying to show you the certain thing, you will try to keep, it'll be implemented in your brain, so you could keep reminding yourself just to automatically do it. So obviously here, the best pawn structure we can have are these 3 pawns. So they almost act united here. They're a good united front against, any ongoing pieces. And, this king, yes, it obviously limits movement for the king. But again, the king has got at least 2 squares to go to, so it'll never be stuck. But also, it's got very good protection that it'll limit, any sort of aggression towards, with black trying to put pressure on us. If we have a look here, even for black, we see that we have obviously come from the Queen's Gambit this opening, with how we've got the pawn structure. Even looking at this, we've got the knight covering it and everything. So, it just takes this pawn structure to move, and as we're going to show you in the next example, how even one move here for the, structure will change everything. So, here, if we look here, being black's go now, we have this pawn structure, and something you've got to be very careful of is obviously this queen being attacked like this. And this pawn doesn't even need to be here, but this just shows a very exaggerated example of how it will happen. Is this bishop here can capture this pawn, putting pressure here onto this. And most of the time you'll see this, especially in the, this can go all the way up to 1500 sort of games. You'll see this massively, how you'll put pressure onto this. It's the common way of making, an attack onto this pawn. So, and if you move it, most of the time you will. Luckily, white will have some escapes in this scenario like this. But 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to do this and actually exchange a bishop for a rook. So it takes 2 moves, and we've lost a pawn here. And most of the time, we'll also lose even worse pawn structure. So instead of the 3 pawns like this, we've now made it so that we've got 1 already off of that, and we've even lost 1. And obviously here, after a capture, you're also a rook down, compared to maybe a rook for a bishop, but, that's 5 points for free. And you're already losing a pawn, so that means you're 3 points down. So, that is it for today's video. Hopefully you understand what the strong and weak pawns there were. So, hopefully you understand about pawn structure, and how we need a good pawn structure here, like this, and also how not to have this sort of structure. Anything like this, avoid completely. If you don't get me wrong, double pawns aren't always the worst, so we'll always try and find a way to play with them. Whether you have to protect them loads or, use them as a defending piece, we'll see. But other than that, hopefully you understand as well with defending the king. So, making sure we keep the pawns all the same. We don't want to be making silly moves, pushing these up 1. Don't get me wrong, you might have to play this move if they're playing a pin on you, for example, or they double pawn you here. There's always going to be ways they'll do it, and also hopefully not having silly, stuff like this where you'll be able to get pinned very easily. So that is it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed. So thank you, and bye-bye.